All right. I am John Ciovacco, which at this point might be obvious. President of Aztech Geothermal, board member with NY-GEO, and putting this track together, some of the thinking was that the grid impacts are a big deal as we move towards electrification, and ground source heat pumps offer a significant portion of the solution for building electrification in a way that won't have negative grid impacts if we do it right. Some of the other sessions earlier today were about trying to figure out how to do that right and trying to understand that better. This session will talk about trying to quantify those benefits in some way that would result in a sustainable way to make the thermal investments instead of the investments in the electrical infrastructure. Make those thermal investments in the geothermal ground loop or the source side of it connected to heat pumps in a way that that doesn't just show up as an extra cost to the building owner. Because right now, the building owner makes that investment, but a lot of the benefits go someplace else. And if those benefits were more directly tied, if we had a better understanding kind of societally, and also from a regulatory standpoint, some of the mechanisms that would bring that value back to the installation of that thermal resource, permanent energy infrastructure, non-intermittent infrastructure. If we can figure out a way to connect that. And I have had the pleasure of having really each of these three gentlemen individually and then sometimes collectively put together ideas about how to quantify that and how we can make those changes. And we're trying to take the next step on that today. We're trying to, again, define what that value could be, kind of on a big scale. Some of the ways that we could structure it from a regulatory standpoint, and then literally come up with some solutions or some sort of calls to action. Because I feel like I've kidded with these guys is that I see their session, I believe it, like I'm sold. Ground source heat pumps, really, the ground loop part should be, it should be free. Like we should just make sure that that's all buildings do that, because that's the only way to really make this work. And then I leave and I go, what am I going to have for lunch? And I don't know what to do. Like it's just it's overwhelming. And we want to try to bring it to more of an actionable basis. Starts with understanding what that value is, quantifying that value, and then moving towards some of the complication around how things work now, how they could work differently. And then we're going to hope we get some calls to action. So we're going to start out with Jens Ponikau from Buffalo Geothermal, the president of NY-GEO, fellow board member, like family. That means, I have mixed feelings about him. Like family. It's good. I think that's good. It's a compliment. So let's bring Jens up here, then we'll have followed by Mark Kleingena and then Jared Rodriguez. And I hope that you feel a little clearer about this and you feel like there's something to do when we're done with it. So let's get started with Jens.
So now you wonder, in case you wonder why Mark, his son, was introducing himself, and I say, Max, and I'm sometimes John's son and sometimes not, depends on what John thinks that day. So,
are we family today?
Today we're family. Okay. So shall I? Hey, yep, that's me. Very good. Welcome again. No, this is good. This is good. So, we talked a lot about air source heat pumps because once you electrify, you have three choices. Electro-resistance heat, which will collapse the grid. Air source heat pumps, in my opinion, will collapse the grid on the worst day of the year. And then you have ground source, who have no grid impact because they will produce it the same way. And this is what monitoring in the field has shown. They have the same COP, whether it's 40 degrees outside or minus 40. It does not matter. So this was actually the NY-GEO has actually looked at this with air source heat pumps. And this is a transit simulation. This is an extremely granular, second by second, every component of an air source heat pump under every condition. So this is extremely complex. It runs weeks to do that for one condition. I'm just emphasizing this is not just a modeling. This is looking extremely granular at how a heat pump, in theory, under best circumstances, can actually perform. And they assumed a model home in Albany, and the average COP was 2.3, which is kind of acceptable. But you know what? At the worst day of the year, at -3 degree design temperature, performed as a 1.12. And the supplement power was required when the demand for the building exceeded 4 kW, and actually the peak demand was 17.5. Wow. Now, how is that looking in the field studies? Well, we had a couple field studies here. This is the CAPMA study, which is you can download on the NY-GEO web, on the NY-GEO web page. Same in-field performance, average 2.25, like okay, and an average outside temperature of 17 degrees. And this was the average demand was 2.77 on that site. However, the maximum was 17. Wow. This is field data now. And that did not even include the resistance demand in there. So how about another study? That's the Hudson Valley study. Same thing, average COP 2.1. It was only 60% roughly of the actually published efficiency. And all the sites that had in there used supplement heat on the colder days, and they didn't measure peak demand. Bummer. But it all shows you similar performances, what NY-GEO has in the transit modeling really came up with, as well as what we see in field studies. Now, how big is the load if we want to electrify every building? Now, our friends of NY-GEO have a publication out there saying the peak, the heating load actually is around 557 tera-BTUs, which is today served with gas as well as oil and fossil fuels. Now, if you convert that to the peak load, and you do that by multiplying it with the full load hours for a certain region in the state, you end up with 123 gigawatts. How much do we have today? Peak winter load is 24, so this is 5 times as much. So this is without hot water, this is without any process heat, and this is without car charging. By the way, you know what the peak demand of car charging is? It's predicted to be about 9 gigawatts. This is 8%, if you charge all the cars in New York State, 8% of what the heating load is. That's the monster we're looking at. And this is when reality sets in. So, having looked at a few of those studies and numbers, there are certain requirements, in my opinion, what a future heating system must do. It must operate independently of how cold it is outside, because that is going to drive all the efficiencies. The outside temperature does not matter, must not matter. It must cover the full load, and we talked about this before, without resistance heat. Because otherwise, if they all go in the system, resistance supplement heat on the same hour of the year, there goes the grid. It must not only reduce the heating load, but we really would benefit also from reducing the cooling load in the summertime. But it must also make sure we run the other big thermal load, the domestic hot water. So we have applications, we see it down in New York City in affordable housing, where a lot of density of people live there. Currently, 50% of the energy goes in hot water making, because it's disproportional to the amount of people living there. Okay. Zero place, we talk a lot about zero place because there's no other building, to my knowledge, which has granular data, minute-by-minute data for all aspects of that building for 2 years on ground source heat pumps. Nowhere in the world do we have that kind of data collected. So this is about a 64,000 square foot building, and this is the loop field over essentially a 12-month period. So you see in the wintertime, in the summertime, in the wintertime, right there, this is a 12-month period. Then it goes up in the summertime because we take all the heat out of the building. It's called air conditioning. And we not reject it in the atmosphere. We put it down in the loop field. We store it. And you can see that we're heating up the ground to about 75 degrees. Then we do the opposite. We draw from that thermal battery. And at the end of the year, we are right where we started. It's amazing. We don't even have to use energy or generate energy to recharge a battery. It's a weird concept, right? So it's the thermal battery. Now, how much did that, at that building, how much did this thermal battery deliver? So this year is, on the worst day of the year, minus 6 degrees outside and 7:15 a.m. in January. The building was using 133 kW. 90% of that energy was thermal energy being put in the building. This is the most efficient building I know. 90% of the entire energy use at that moment was heat. 10% was everything else. Just to emphasize, you have the most efficient envelope I'm aware of, and you still put 90% of all the energy use into heat at that moment. Again, that's the monster for the grid. However, here comes the trick. This was not all coming from the grid. 84 kW, but 63% came from the ground. And it shaved off what the grid was using. So the actual grid drawing for thermal heat was 35 kW, and again, 13 kW for everything else. Elevators, plugs, lights, stoves, dryers. That is what saved the grid here, that we got 63% on the worst moment, and that what it shaved off the capacity. So the question is, how much is this worth, right? How much would it cost today with today's technology to be put in the grid? Well, here are a couple examples of grid capacity costs. These are real, these are today. So we're building this, the transmission line to Canada to get hydropower. And how much does it cost? It costs $6 billion. And it has a 1.2 gigawatt capacity. That means $5,000 for every kW of capacity. 5,000. But the problem is, it doesn't include the cost of the hydropower from Canada. It's only for the transmission line. And that contract is only for the summer, not for the winter, because in the winter, the Canadians needed themselves for heat. So, offshore wind, Empire 1 was canceled the last week. Permit was pulled from the current administration in Washington. Anyway, but the contract was signed for $3 billion for 810 megawatts of capacity, rated capacity. That is 3,700 kW, dollars per kW. That's for the generation. Both. Plus an additional $9.3 billion for the next 25 years at 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So for the maintenance and then for the actual generation, not the upfront costs, an additional $9.3 billion. So you look at this present value, that's about $1,000 per kW. So we're around 4,700 there. Utility distribution costs, Con Ed is going to laugh about this, but I'm saying it's anywhere between $2,500 and $3,500, much more higher in the US city market, a little bit less in rural New York. But this is for the substations for the transmission to the buildings. And I would argue some of that stuff is additive. You need all of them, right? You need transmission lines, all that stuff for peak. So if you add it all up, I come up and I'll show you in a second where that number comes from, $11,300 something. Today's cost of getting an electron from A to B into your house. Right now, I would argue GEO can do the same for 40%. How?
Green.
3 minutes. Oh, geez, now I'm going to hurry. $350,000 was the cost of the loop field at zero place. It delivered 84 kW in that moment. And this is what we're looking, what an air source heat pump at a 1 COP would actually cost for 84 kW, what the ground field there has delivered. So these are the added costs together. There's some overlap, but keep in mind, this is, for example, with wind. The wind doesn't always blow at the monetary value. How about storage? We haven't even talked about storage, that we need storage to bridge something. Well, the loop field in one day at zero place delivered, only the loop field delivered was 1,706 kilowatt hours for a 24-hour period. Because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, right? Specifically at night when our peak is. Well, at current costs, and this is the current cost of grid battery in New York State, as published by NY-GEO, it's $567 per kilowatt hour. In one day, the amount of energy delivered by that loop field on the peak day was worth about $1 million bucks. But keep in mind, we don't have solar at 70 N when the peak is. And keep in mind, the wind doesn't always blow. So there are, for example, 74 instances in a year where the wind capacity of the entire fleet of windmills in New York State was essentially below 100 megawatts. 5% of their capacity. That's pretty much 1/5 of the time. Also looking at zero place, these are the peak numbers here. The load ladder was 1,100 kW. Then they put GEO in from air source. They reduced it to 343 kW. The most amount of building peak demand in heating, interestingly, pretty much the same in cooling, was 43 kW. 4% of what the original load ladder was with air source heat pumps. And this is the kW, 600 kilowatt hours, 600, what is the average electricity use of a New York State apartment on gas. So that excludes the heating. Here, everything is now electrified on NY-GEO, and the entire apartments use about 60% of what a today apartment where the grid is sized for is using every month.
Bring it home, brother.
Well, bring it home. So for me, the loop field is really the ultimate thermal battery. And it stores all the thermal energy we need for the entire season. It doesn't need to be recharged. It actually stabilizes when it gets too cold because it goes through some phase change. It reacts instantaneously to input and output. Right now, during the day, we're putting heat in because some of it was running in air conditioning. At night, we're taking it back out. And every single second, that load changes. It acts like an electric battery. The danger is that we see already softening in New York State because we say that the All-Electric Building Act provides a little provision here and there to say, well, if we can't connect you within 18 months, we're going to allow you to put a new building on gas. And we don't want that because we have the technology which makes that not necessary. So that is the danger if we can't find a solution and implement it. Sooner or later, somebody's going to pull the plug on this, electrification. That's what we don't want. The take-home message is we have the technology. We have proven over and over and over with multiple field studies now how it works, that it works, and it is beyond our expectations. And I didn't measure that. NY-GEO did. So don't let me have my conclusion now. So the point is the ground is capable of supplying 70% of the needed generated capacity. It avoids that. It's the ultimate distributed energy resource. It's right there. It's underneath the building. And all the buildings we put GEO in have immediate passive house standard. Even the old ones we just put GEO in perform as passive house standard, which is a 50-year-old building stock. That's how efficient the GEO system is. It is really the only choice we have to make this transfer, because it's by far the biggest load is the heating, and it's the only one we can now tap into and generate on site in that way. We've got nothing else. And in a way, it's not really dispatched, but it reacts like a dispatchable battery because it delivers more when the load is higher. It's always 70%. They don't bow down when it gets cold outside. That is a fascinating factor. So whenever the building load goes up because it's cold outside, the ground is delivering more because more heat gets extracted from it. So the take-home message is, whatever we get from the ground, we don't need to get from the grid. And he's not family today. He's not welcome. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Now, if you're thinking about where you're going to go for dinner tonight, the other two guys are gonna make it easier for you to take some action. Come up here, Mark. Make me proud.
With no idea when I have to do with dinner, but I tell you what.
There are those who will say I make a mean gumbo, though. Anyway, so thanks, Jens and John, for the opportunity to talk about this stuff. Is this the pointer here?
Yeah.
Woo! All right. I'm Mark Langen. I work with Jared. I do whatever he tells me to do. And he told me to come here and talk about this stuff. So Jens laid out some very great and important numbers around the value across the value stack when it comes to electric grid impacts when it comes to heating. And I'm going to go into it a little bit differently. I'm going to take it sort of from the meter back and take a look at it that way. And then ultimately, I'm going to make some very strong recommendations about what folks in this room can do to make sure that we do get this very valuable resource quantified and captured. Okay, that's really where we're at here. So if I just touch this, oh, look at that. All right, so there's a mismatch in financial recovery for the value provided. And I apologize, I'm an economist, so a lot of this is going to be like economics type stuff. But this is how we need to talk to regulators so that we can get them to give us the money to build these things. All right, so mismatch in financial recovery for the value provided. As we've seen from Jen's presentation, there are major capacity benefits of ground source heat pump deployment to the electric grid at each functional level. At the generation level, so the wind, the gas-fired power plant, the hydro, the solar, whatever it is, that's the generation piece. The transmission piece, moving it from the utility scale generation or the utility scale electricity from the place where we make it to the distribution place or the load center. And then finally at the distribution level, there's value there as well because, oh, guess what? The loop field is local. So it provides value at the load, not someplace back on the other side of the load or on the other side of the transmission grid, but actually at the load. That's significant and valuable because there are no losses associated with it. So this is important. We also know that we've not been able to capture these benefits to the grid as developers of TENS projects or developers of folks who do just primarily ground source heat pumps. So we're not getting these dollars, but providing the value to the grid for them, okay? So this is basically a nice little picture that shows gen, trans, distribution. This is what it looks like. And at each level, generation, transmission, and distribution, a ground source heat pump provides value to the grid, okay? So that's where we really need to take a look at this. All right, so what's the source of the mismatch? Well, a thermal network, when we think about a thermal network, we think about, well, what does it do for heating and cooling, right? What does it do? Well, it means we have to use less electricity. That's great. But most cost comparisons are developed as comparisons at the residential or commercial meter based on unit heating costs. Okay, that's how we look at this. We look at, well, you know, we've got a COP of 5 and the air source heat pump has an average COP of 3, so then we run the numbers and it doesn't make sense, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. The actual benefits of GSHP and their networks are not fully realized by developers. The electric grid becomes an economic free rider, okay? Meaning that the grid doesn't pay for the unloading that occurs, sorry about that, doesn't pay for the unloading that occurs, but it gets to take advantage of the unloading that occurs and not pay for it. Okay, so these are my numbers, and this is about the only numbers I'm going to have in the whole presentation, but basically what I've done here is I've taken a residential air source heat pump installation versus a ground source heat pump installation. I assume the annual heating consumption is 15,000 kW here, 9,000 kW here. Electricity rate's the same. Payment for a new heat pump is $2,800 over a 20-year life, and $5,200 a year for a ground source over that life. The annual heating cost comes in $65.58, and then for a GHP it comes in at $74.66, meaning that the difference before the allocation of incremental distribution, about $907 to the bad. There's no headroom in this case for a ground source heat pump, okay? We can argue about these numbers all day. I don't want to talk about that now. I just want to show that what's really happening here is when you add in the increased demand due to a lower COP, okay, you actually have a total heating cost, if it's fairly allocated and fully loaded, where the ground source heat pump comes back and provides about $4,300 extra dollars to the homeowner if he had to pay the full boat for the increased demand that he's responsible for, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, we can talk about it during the question period. But this is really what's going on here, is the grid or the air source heat pump installation is in fact a free rider on what could happen over here on the ground source heat pump, okay? Questions on that? All right, we'll move through. So what's happening here? We have a free rider problem. One of the main reasons we know that we're not capturing the electric capacity value of the GSHP is because we see TENS developed at campuses. Who has a thermal energy network? Who does geothermal? College campuses. Why? Because they capture all the rents, because they don't have to put a new distribution system in. That becomes important, right? They have the ability to capture all these things, and so they say, hey, we got a campus, we can make this happen, right? So if you can get that boundary line drawn correctly, you can actually get some value here. In reality, the entire electric system is a free rider on the 10, as the value of lower peaks is spread very thinly across the entire rate base, okay? Now, I'd also point out that the costs in my simplified example are underestimated because they're based on embedded costs, not marginal costs. And for those who aren't rate geeks, that's important. What that means is that it's not the cost to build it out, but it's actually the cost that's in the ground to serve this. And it's also based on distribution only. Jen's made a very nice point about we've got generation and we've got transmission as well. That's important. So regardless, we've got this free rider problem, okay? So how do we make the free rider pay? There are pathways to making the 10 receive the appropriate compensation from the electric grid, okay? So wholesale capacity markets already exist to compensate demand response and energy efficiency measures, okay? We've had demand response in one form or another for 50 years. We have it codified in a bunch of places. FERC has Order 745. We've had it codified in a bunch of places in PJM, in New York ISO, in ISO New England, okay? This exists. We can get wholesale capacity if we can show that this is a resource, okay? Wholesale transmission markets publish open access transmission tariffs. So if you are able to lower how much network transmission you use, okay, you can get the price signal to load serving entities, and that can be that value stack is available as well. And then finally, non-wireless alternatives have been used by distribution utilities, particularly, as we know, in Brooklyn, Queens, to lower peak costs to avoid expensive new distribution infrastructure, okay? So there are mechanisms, right, to get this value in the hands of the developer. There are mechanisms. I didn't say it was going to be easy, though. Did I say it was going to be easy? No, it's not. We got to fight for this, okay? And here's how we fight for it, all right? The first thing we need to do is measure the
We fight
ability
for
of the
it in
tent.
4 minutes.
I'm sorry.
We fight for it in the next 4 minutes, right? 4 minutes or so.
Yeah. Okay.
It's like Oz, you know?
What's that?
It's Oz
I
speaking
thought
to
I
you.
was family.
You're doing
he's
great.
Family. I'm not family. I'm not.
You're right
family,
on the
so I don't
edge
get
of
the
family.
Anyway,
Literally.
I got 2 slides left up here.
I love that.
I'm cruising.
Let's go.
I know exactly. You want just let me get through it. All right. So what do we need to make to make this money available to the 10 developer? What do we have to do? Okay. Well, the first thing, and Will made it, I think. Was Will here? Will Lang made. I don't know. He had this great data. Okay, that showed what the COP was at different places and different times in the last thing, and that's awesome. That's awesome. But the problem is that only shows me what it is now. I needed to know what it was before because he's already provided that COP. So now what we need to do is we need to get the before. And so what do we do here? Measure the ability of the 10 to reduce peak load. Every pilot in every state must mandate that the utility prepare an electric peak reduction measurement protocol. Okay? What is this thing going to do? I want to know, and I want you to tell me how you're going to measure that. Are you going to hang a meter at the distribution center, at the transformer, at every house along the way, incrementally? Is that what you're going to do? Great, because that's what you need to do, because we need to know the value of this. Every pilot in every state must mandate that the utility who develops the 10 immediately hang interval meters before all loads, so we can know how much we've brought it down. Okay? Get the metering out there now so that we can say, and I'm not talking about just the electric meter, the gas meter too, so that we can say, okay, well, we took this guy off gas. He was using this many BTUs before. Now he's using this. Okay? And we convert that, and we convert it into a capacity value. And make all such measurements transparent to all stakeholders. Okay? So that everybody can see what's actually going on here. The ISO can see, the regulatory body can see, the town can see, the municipality can see, the customer can see, the utility can see, and make it absolutely transparent. And the last thing is make this money available to 10 developers. Participate with an interested and coordinated voice at the following proceedings in your state. Electric rate cases. Make the electric company understand that this is a non-wires alternative. Gas rate cases, same thing. Gas planning dockets. And grid of the future proceedings, okay? We're having one in New York right now. Get on it and be involved so that this value can be captured and we can get this money into the system to build these things out. I'm done.
It's lovely.
We're going to get Jared up there.
You ready? Okay. Where's the clicker? Do I need the clicker? No. All right. So I'm going to talk about some of the framing and frameworks that we could develop to get at creating this value for thermal energy networks and ground source heat pumps. So here's some questions that we as an industry and in general New York State and other states need to grapple with, right? So how do we deliver on the promise of affordable decarbonization? Right, because this is an issue of affordability. Can we afford to transition our economy away from fossil fuels? Some will say no. Right, you hear that all the time. They say it louder than we say anything, by the way. So we could be a little bit louder. We could. How do we maintain a competitive landscape and reduce barriers to entry for the many parties that have to participate in doing this extremely difficult work, right? What's the role of merchant thermal energy suppliers? I'll talk about what that might mean. Will the regulatory process incorporate best practices? If there's any regulators in the room, not questioning whether you follow best practices, but will you follow best practices? And where do we go from here? What's the best way to encourage TENS and ground source heat pump growth? What market mechanisms are possible to create that growth? And then how do we unlock that market? What does the market even look like? So how do we appropriately utilize diverse, available local thermal energy resources to their full extent? So we're at a GEO conference. Everything is GEO, poke holes in the ground, as many holes as we can. Right? But that's not the only heat that's available in a community. There's a lot of heat, excess heat, waste heat, ambient heat in water bodies, elsewhere underground, that's available for tapping. And if we can appropriately tap that and move it appropriately, we don't need as many boreholes, sorry. And then we have a system that might be a little bit less expensive and more competitive. So how do we take these pipes that share the heat across users and producers and create the right regulatory framework around that to create a market so that you, as a thermal energy resource provider or a geothermal developer, can connect wherever that system is available and receive the right compensation for the value that you're providing to this network. So think, solar developer and grid. That's what you could become. So this is the most important thing that we need to do. If we're transitioning our economy away from fossil fuels, we have to beat the peak. And not just the future winter peak, which we say is coming, but we have to beat our current peak. No one talks about that. We have a current peak in July or August in New York State. We could lower that right now with the technology that, you're all here to learn about. So why aren't we having that conversation? Growth, right? Data centers, AI, EV charging. We could lower our building peaks today and try to manage that peak growth, maybe not even shift it into the winter. Do we have to create a new peak? So let's assume the following thing, right? So state utility regulatory authorities can and should create and encourage an open access common carrier regulatory framework for thermal energy networks. All right, and let me talk about what that means. So a common carrier open access framework could function similarly to how the electric system or the gas system works, where there's multiple providers that can interconnect with a system and freely supply customers. A customer could be a producer and a consumer. They could be a prosumer. They could be compensated for whatever excess capacity they have. And they should be. And they should receive that entire value stack that they're delivering to this open system. It means that many parties can participate, and if they participate in the right way and they follow the clear rules that are defined, they can make money off of participating. That's what it means to create a market. Markets just don't happen, they get created, they get defined. And in New York, they get defined by a regulator that sits in Albany. So imagine the grid, right? Thermal and electric, like a bathtub. You see my little town that's drowning in the bathtub here. Maybe the water level's too high. So how could we induce using power in such a way that might lower that water level? What if the water level goes too low? What do we need to do to tell folks or send a signal to put more water into the tub? So that's what we have to do. We have to keep the tub full and at the right exact level, or else we drown the little town, right? Or blow up the grid. So what have we done in New York? And then what do we need to do? So first, we have to define TENS as a regulated utility service, right, for regulated investor-owned utilities. And we've done that. We passed the Utility Thermal Energy Networks and Jobs Act. It was passed a while ago, and we're in this brutal regulatory process to define what a thermal utility is and who can do it and who should be allowed to do it and who can do it in a regulated way or in an unregulated way. What does regulation mean? Is there light regulation or heavy regulation? Who fits in what bucket and how do they act and how do they function within this defined marketplace? We established who that regulator is that creates this market, and they're in the process of creating a market. That's what they do. It's the Public Service Commission and their staff, and they sit in Albany in a pretty big building. They've launched pilot projects. So how does a regulated investor-owned utility that has never done this before do a pilot project? They're expensive as hell. The learning curve is ridiculous. The things that these regulated investor-owned utilities think they need to do in order to implement these projects are a little bit crazy, and they're driving costs up. So what are they doing that's driving costs up? Can we pay attention and call them out when they do that? Because, all I hear is, this is expensive, right? Well, compared to what? Compared to what? Compared to an existing gas system that's been in the ground for 100 years? Yeah, sure. Sure, but we're being told that we can't have that gas system anymore. So compared to what? This is expensive, right? So they've also started to define who these participants are and whether or not they'll be regulated. And they've kind of left a few things sort of open-ended, right? So they released rules almost a year ago that begin to define this framework. And they have a lot more work to do, the regulator. What do we need to do? Well, I think we need to exempt municipalities, right? In New York State, we have home rule. We have municipalities that set their own rules. Every time the state has attempted to step in and say, hey, we don't think you can set your own rules. Like, we'll set your rules. People show up with pitchforks and lit torches, right? So if the regulator thinks that they're going to do that in this context to municipalities, I'm getting out my lighters and I'm going to hand out some torches. So I don't think that the regulator should be telling communities how to set prices for thermal energy or whether or not they can own those systems. We have the right to do that because we democratically elect our leaders. We don't democratically elect public service commissioners. Okay? So very important. I think that's one of the most important things. So then the next thing is mandate open access requirements. So a regulated investor-owned utility that owns the pipe in the ground can't tell you that you can't inject heat into that pipe because they want to own the heat injection supply. No, they're not allowed to do that. They can't monopolize a market. You have to keep it open. We need to have open access. So what are the rules for you to participate in the market so that you can inject the heat into the system and get properly paid for it? Really important that we do that. Create a thermal energy cost recovery structure. So that goes a little bit into what Mark was saying. What does it look like to recover the cost of the pipe that's distributing the heat, whether it's owned by a municipality, a cooperative, customers own it, or the regulated investor-owned utility owns it? What does that structure or that rate structure look like? And how is that governed by the regulator, right? And then establish interconnection standards. So we have to have a common way of delivering heat from the pipe into the building, measuring it, right? Hang a meter. And we also have to have a common way of a thermal energy supplier, like a geothermal system developer, to inject into that system and get paid for it. So what do those systems look like if they're standardized? And that's one other way of creating a market, standards for participation. And then this is probably the most important one, actually, monetize all these co-benefits of thermal energy networks. So bring value associated with that avoided electric grid infrastructure as we transition the economy. Economic development opportunities, this is huge, and gas decommissioning, et cetera. So a thermal energy network, if you're pulling equipment, say, out of a building, it means that that building is cheaper to build, right? We can have a debate about that. But what does that mean for affordable housing? Is there a co-benefit there that we need to be talking about, right, in a community? So really important concepts. And so what can you do, right? This is all about what can we do. You can scan these QR codes and delve into the amazing universe that is the New York State DPS Matter Master. What is that? I didn't even want to show you a picture of it because it's brutal. It's a platform where you could basically search in a search bar like almost anything going on within a regulatory proceeding. So they give each regulatory proceeding a number. You can go in and you could see every single piece of information or document that's been uploaded into that proceeding from all the parties that are participating. There's climate activists participating. There's utilities participating. The Koch brothers are participating in interesting ways. Everyone's participating, and they're uploading documents, and they're attempting to influence the regulator toward a particular outcome. So if you liked some of the things that you heard me say today, and some of them are listed here, join this thing and start uploading letters to the regulator telling them to support particular outcomes, telling them to frame a marketplace, right, that can work for you and your industry. Like, we don't let this happen to us. We have to make it happen. And the problem is a lot of people that don't even know that this is a thing. They don't know this is happening. But like, we have a lot more control over the outcomes here than anyone thinks. And if we can get together and start saying the same thing in a unified way, we can make that outcome happen. So that's where I'm going to end this. Yep.
All right. I'm going to jump to questions. I'll take some questions, but I certainly have some thoughts too. But anybody have anything burning that's out there? Or are you just thinking, oh, I don't know what to do now? So, oh, good. Audience questions always best.
Thanks.
Your name?
Steve Martino, CDM Smith. Phenomenal presentation across the board. Really, glad I stayed. Question I have about what you were talking about, metering everything ahead of time, so then we can see how much we've improved it. Would you agree that that's got to somehow be performance-based, like a coefficient of performance before and after? Because I was talking to someone from a different session, like the housing project that won the award. They said once that got built, a lot more people had access to air conditioning they didn't have before it got built. So it was a lot more cooling load in the building from an absolute value standpoint, even though that cooling was being provided way more efficiently than if they had a whole 88 units of window air conditioners in there. So when you do that measuring, would you agree that it's got to be performance-based, apples to apples, before and after, right?
I think that I don't know if I could turn this on or not.
It might be on.
Can you hear me? Oh, it is on. How about that? Hey, no, I think that the reason I began with it, you need to design the measurement protocol, right, to capture all of those types of things. And I'm not going to sit here and suggest that I know what that protocol looks like. I can make some suggestions, but as an industry, okay, both on the geo side, the gas side, and the electric side, we need to sit down and say, this is what the protocol needs to look like. So you can capture exactly what you're talking about is, oh, there's an actual addition here that would have been much higher, right, if they put AC on, and there's value in that. So yes, absolutely, 100%.
Well, yeah, and we had the same scenario with the Lockport Housing Authority. Because now the regulators, the PSC, was afraid, oh my God, we're putting all those great geosystems in, and now everybody can use air conditioning, and that actually going to significantly increase the summer load on it. The interesting part was that about 1/3 of the customers had very inefficient window-based air conditioners. Now everybody, 3 times as many, had 100% geo air conditioning. The load went down because geo is so much more efficient than the old clunkers up there. So the bottom line is we have now working examples. Hugh Henderson is putting the paper together for NY-SERDA. It's already in draft form to demonstrate that to people. That is really the value. We have the data now to make those points or counter those points.
So the state anticipated some of this. and they've essentially mandated particular metering typologies on the electric side that give us that granular data. So like New York City, Westchester, maybe it's the entire state now has like digital metering. I don't know if you remember, like the wireless connection from the meter was going to give everybody cancer. Remember that whole discussion? Yeah. So now we've got the data for existing buildings, and we can do that before or after.
Okay. Additional questions? I think there was another question out there.
So
And you are?
John Pfeiffer with ICF. I'm working on one of the U10s in Poughkeepsie. So all the grid savings are predicated on a savings compared to air source heat pumps, right? So what about when you're going from gas to any kind of heat pump? You're actually increasing the peak load on the electric grid, right?
Well, it's an interesting question because the data I showed you on actual field studies, that was not necessarily the case. So because the entire building was operating with less electricity despite being fully electrified with GEO at a lower demand, peak demand, and a lower overall consumption than the average apartment is today, which I would argue that's what the grid is sized for already.
So, yeah, so do we have to exacerbate a current peak? Can we electrify buildings and stay under our cap? Can we create a mechanism inside the market that says this is capped? And if you think you're going to go over, you're going to pay for it. And if you can go under, you're going to get paid to stay under. That's the mechanism. It's almost like a cap and trade. But we can do that with local electric grids.
Yeah, I would say quickly that certainly when we go from a fossil fuel system to an electrified system, whether that electrified system is air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, with all things being equal, there's going to be more kWh in both cases because now we're not using fossil fuels during that heating season. We're using an electric-based system, even if it's a very efficient one. The thing is that with a ground source heat pump, the hope is, and some of the earlier sessions talked about this, how do we make sure that we deliver on that promise? How do we make sure that we design in a way that we don't increase the peak? But the peak is really the game. And so a fossil fuel system that has air conditioning usually has its peak in the summer. We'll lower that summer peak, and the winter peak will be lower than that summer peak was before, and probably go a little bit higher than the summer peak, say, of the geothermal system. But it's really, will that building experience a higher peak is from a bigger grid perspective, the bigger question. There certainly are bill impact studies that need to be done comparing the additional kWh to the displacement of the therms or oil or propane or whatever it is. And that's a little bit, like Mark was saying, that's usually based on kind of just looking at a very sort of granular, what's the rate for electricity, what's the rate for natural gas. That, even though that we have to do that because that's our reality today, it's really not the right long-term way to look at this, or we don't really have rates that are designed to reward the lower peak that our system will give when designed properly. Do you have a comment about that, Mark?
I do. I think if you look at it in a holistic sense, and you look at exactly what it costs to deliver peak gas, that ain't cheap. Okay, so if you can actually back off the costs for peak gas, and what that last 100,000, 200,000, half a BCF a day costs on design day, you're going to have a significantly cheaper way to go with what Jens is proposing. And that, I mean, so yeah, gas is cheap on a commodity basis, but it ain't cheap on a peak day. No way.
Right. And unfortunately, in the ICF world and in the world that I live in too, in some of these U10s, we're kind of, we're not really allowed to look at that scale. Like, that's not the game we're playing in, but that's something we're just trying to introduce here, is that there's a bigger game, and we need to find ways to account for that better. Why don't we grab one more question as we're at time here, and then we'll wrap it up. Oh no, here comes trouble. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Julia Pagliatti from National Grid. I had a question on whether you guys are thinking about how to entice customers to convert to electricity. And do you see it as a mandated from the state, and if not, what kind of incentives are you thinking of giving them to convert?
It's a question of carrots and sticks.
So mandated or?
So we have mandates that are happening in New York State, across New York State for new construction. We have
Existing.
and then for existing in places like New York City, we've got Local Law 97, which puts a price on carbon above a certain cap, causing and compelling, users to begin switching to electricity, and building owners are preparing for and implementing those projects now. So we're seeing accelerated electrification in buildings in New York City, for example. So that's the stick. The carrot could be if the thermal network is on Main Street, right? And I have an old fossil-fired gas furnace in my building. If I connect to the thermal network, how much cheaper is it for me up front to make the connection than to replace my existing equipment? What's the net present value of that decision, right? So we can work with costs and rates and frameworks and participation frameworks, et cetera, in order to compel people to act and follow a market, right? So also back to just tying this to the other question that was brought up, there's also a non-pipe alternative, which I'm sure you're pretty familiar with.
Yeah, that's the program I'm heading.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
the cost is really, when you do the cost to convert to electrification, is very, very expensive.
The thing that I always raise is, what do you mean? What
mean
type
full
of
house electrification.
What kind of
Well, air
electrification?
source is what we have.
Sure, but like what and how? Because every house is different.
Like an existing house,
Yep.
not new buildings, existing house where you have to replace the gas stove, the gas oven, the gas dryer, the gas heater, for heating, and envelope upgrades, including windows, air sealing, that.
But there might be 30 different approaches to doing what you're describing, and they all have different costs. So
I'm not sure what the 30.
there isn't one way to electrify a building, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Well, if you're talking about a whole house electrification, then everything has to be electrified. Every appliance.
We can talk after I can describe what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
So maybe a comment on that is that our costs, we socialize the costs, and we show customers a blended rate. And one of the biggest biggest impact I ever had on some members of the DPS is when I showed them a whole new development, 100% electrified, all on geothermal, and then I showed them the gas meter of the brand new buildings for the fireplace. In other words, it was $15,000 in a house to connect that house to the gas network so we can have a fireplace a couple of days a year. Why? Because both the developer and the customer did not pay for that. The costs were socialized and they were put on the rate, on the gas rate. So what I'm saying is there's a complete disconnect. It was a good system for many, many years because we wanted to socialize the costs of the infrastructure, the capacity costs. But it doesn't fit today anymore because this is not where your costs are. And unfortunately, the backfire is that we created an attitude to say, hey, it doesn't cost me anything, so I want it. It's cost we are paying for. It's like a tax on everybody. And we have to essentially induce a little bit of pain for people who don't care about that. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that's everybody. And it's really that we have to come up with a different matrix on how we charge for that. Because that is the antiquated problem. Even today's programs are there and saying either how much total energy do we save? I'm sorry, that is not the capacity cost of the grid. Every utility's costs are by capacity they're creating. And the top is, I always give the example, do we have any drillers in the room here? Drillers? No? Let's say you're buying a drill rig.
So,
And now you're using that only 1 hour a year. Wouldn't that be a terrible investment? Why are we doing this?
Yeah, that entire system, the image that Mark showed, that entire system, all of those things, you see it every day, right? Wires and power plants and everything. It's all there for 15 minutes. The biggest peak. Can we just willy-nilly afford to make that even bigger for 15 minutes? No, not as a society. We can't do it. We have to think smartly about this.
All right, we're going to need to wrap up. But I would acknowledge what Julia's saying is that when you just look at how much does it cost to replace the stove, the dryer, the water heater, a heat pump, you put all those numbers together, that's kind of just in the reality that we're in right now, and it doesn't pencil out, on using that math. And a little like the U10s we talked about. It does. What we're suggesting through this series of presentations is there's a lot of value that really, really intelligent electrification brings, but we don't necessarily access that value. So we're looking at retail costs of things, we're drawing the circle too small. And you're still, and a lot of us, we're all a little bit handcuffed by the old system that we all live in, but we're trying to figure out how do we communicate the value that this technology brings, how do we make that monetizable, and how do we bring it back in? And we've given some ideas about how to do that, some things we can participate in, but the reality is you got to have a tough job right now because your circle's drawn too small, and you don't really you can't grab that value out there and bring it to your project to make it pencil out. Right. But that's, so a lot of us feel the conundrum, but we shouldn't feel powerless around it. There are things that we need to do. So we do need to wrap up. These folks will be around a little bit. Want to make sure that we clear out the room for the next one. Visit some exhibitors. Hug a driller. Maybe warn him in advance. Thanks so much.
You're invited.